Please welcome Rafael Mangual. Welcome. Rafael, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a real honor and very exciting.
Oh yeah, this is great. I'm glad to have you here because you've written a really interesting book that in many ways argues, decarceration and depolicing is leading America down the wrong path. So I'd love to know, just off the bat, what do you think people who want to defund the police and reallocate the resources or reduce incarceration, what do you think they're getting wrong?
Well, I think they're getting a couple of things wrong. One is that I think they misunderstand what the causes of crime are, right? The defund movement is kind of built around this idea that if we just divert this funding away from policing and incarceration and prosecution and give it to other community programs, social spending programs, that we can reduce crime that way. But this assumes that the causes of crime, the root causes of crime, so to speak, are socioeconomic in nature. I don't think they are. I know it's counter to the sort of conventional wisdom, but if you look at New York City, for example, where we all are, one of the safest cities in America, 1989, our poverty rate was actually slightly lower than it was in 2016. Why do I pick those 2 years? Because those are the years that preceded the peak number of murders of 2,262 in 1990 and the valley number of murders, 292 in 2017. So we were able to get crime drastically down without doing anything about poverty. We don't see violence sort of track with other, socioeconomic problems, unemployment, et cetera. So that I think is a major pillar of what they get wrong. The other thing is frankly, I think they misunderstand what the research says about police, which is that more policing means less crime, and the people who benefit are the people who are dealing with the biggest crime problems, and that's really who I wrote the book for.
Well, let's jump into that because you are a data person.
Yes.
That is something that even your critics don't detract from you. They say you are a data person. And many of the statements you make in the book are supported by data or you argue based on the data that you've received. But there are a few things that I find confusing. The one that you just said is more policing equals less crime.
Yes.
Right? But in America, you see policing increase. By your argument, why is it that any number would go up from one previous year when the policing has only increased from year to year? How do you explain that?
So, there are a lot of reasons for why that. So one is that the effectiveness of police has a lot to do with other things that are going on in the criminal justice system, right? So when police officers make an arrest and they take a criminal off the street, the benefits associated with that arrest are going to be different if you're talking about a jurisdiction in which the prosecutor isn't going to bring charges, which we see much more often now, in which a lengthy sentence is less likely, which we see much more often now, or in which the punishments on the table are no longer going to incapacitate the individuals and take them off the street. So in a lot of cities, despite this fact that spending on police has remained steady or even gone up, we have seen crime go up. But the reasons for that is not because policing is ineffective. Every single econometric analysis that's worth its salt, that's actually looked at the impact of policing on crime, finds that you get less crime when you increase policing, and that those benefits are sort of disproportionately enjoyed by low-income minority communities, which is a really important point, because again, that's who I wrote this book for.
It's interesting that you say that because you talk in the book about mass incarceration, you talk in the book about things like stop and frisk, you even talk about victimization. What I find confusing in the book is you will talk about stop and frisk, and from what I gather in the book, you're pro stop and frisk. Right?
I would say.
Or you're not against it, maybe?
I'm not against it.
Okay,
yeah,
you're not against it.
It's a tool that should be on the table.
Okay, so now what's confusing in the book is you make an argument that seems like you are blaming the people who are being disproportionately stopped and frisked for how they act. There's a part in the book where you say, and I'll paraphrase, don't get me wrong, is you say it's because they act street or they look criminal and so the police stop them when they shouldn't stop them. So my question to you is this: what is acting street or acting criminal, and who gets to define that?
So there's that chapter you're talking about is the chapter on false positives, right? The false positive is the kind of situation in which a cop stops somebody based on suspicion, and it turns out that person doesn't have any contraband. Right. The chapter is based on a really important sociological work by a kind of left-of-center sociologist named Elijah Anderson called Code of the Street. And it's an ethnographic work that's based in North Philadelphia in the early 90s, late 80s. And what he finds is that there is a kind of street culture where people adopt an outward-facing posture that's been well documented in research across the years, where you kind of, one example I give the book actually is from my personal life. I didn't always look like this. I didn't always dress like this. When I was a kid, I had, cornrows when I was 16 and, had that kind of thug attitude and hung out with some bad kids. And I tell the story about one day being in the mall in Long Island. We're walking down the corridor. We all kind of got our thug walks going on. And we walked past a group of white kids. And they kind of diverted their eyes, and we all got off on it. We all thought it was like, hey, we're these tough guys. And, we got a sense that this was something good. A few days later, I was in my local deli and got online behind a white woman who kind of noticed me behind her and turned around and very discreetly clutched her purse. And I remember feeling offended, saying like, what's this lady's problem? I've never thought about robbing anyone a day in my life. And what I realized in that moment was that she was picking up on the very same signals that we were perfectly happy for those other kids to pick up. And what Elijah argues...
Yeah, but before you go further on this. So the issue I have with this argument is, in many ways, it sounds like what you are saying is that the way of being is what people should change, because the way of being is what determines whether you are perceived as a criminal or not, right?
It may sound
but like, listen to what you just said. You just said, I had the cornrows and all kinds, I was in the thugging. What does cornrows have to do with being a criminal or not? Like, this is the problem in America. Right? No, wait, I'm just saying. So what I notice in the book is it seems like you make an argument that, without explicitly saying it, and maybe you're not even saying that, it's almost like you're implicitly saying what we need to do as people of color is just be a little more white. Just be a little more, let's get a little, no, you're saying a little less of the baggy, the walk and the talk, and let's be a little, because that woman who clutched her purse, that has nothing to do with you. That's her clutching her purse, right?
So that, in fact, if you read the chapter in its entirety, you'll see that I very explicitly say that it would be entirely wrong to blame people for these things.
Right.
And that these interactions are incredibly embarrassing, infuriating. They shouldn't happen. And so it's not an excuse for bad policing. What it is, it's an explanation for why some of these mistakes may be happening.
But wait, here's the thing. Forgive me for interrupting. Here's the thing. I understand that you say it's a mistake, but at the same time you say that it is not a mistake because the person is making an active decision. It doesn't seem like a mistake, it seems like an act of discrimination. And so let's think of it like this, using a stupid analogy, right? You have police who you are arguing in the book, and we've seen this in society, are not able to discern. They just go like, well, those black people who walk like this must all be criminals. I'm going to search all of them. I'm going to spoil all of their days, right? But isn't that then a sign that the police need to be reformed?
Absolutely.
Because they are the people who are making this decision incorrectly, right? If we had a bunch of pilots, who, let's say there's a bunch of pilots who crash all the time, right? A bunch of pilots who crash all the time, and then it's like, oh, why do they crash? Oh, they can't tell the difference between mountains and the runway.
Right.
We wouldn't say like, well, the mountains have got to change how they look because they look like the runway. We'd be like, the pilots need to learn how to be better pilots. Wouldn't you say that?
Yeah, absolutely. The chapter, it's really, really important that you understand that that chapter is not about excusing false positives or saying that they are good things or that people somehow deserve them. It's an attempt to explain what's going on in a way that I think lowers the temperature of our rhetorical debate, because evidence of false positives is taken to be prima facie evidence of racial bias on the part of the police officer.
Are you saying it's not?
Not necessarily. What they may be picking up on are outward-facing postures that have been associated
but what are the postures and how are they associated
the same
with?
ones that I quote Nipsey Hussle talking about in that very same chapter, where he says, when I was in a gang and we were going out looking for an op, we weren't looking for somebody who was dressed square. We were looking for someone who looked like us, who walked like us, who had the attitude that we had, and it was wrong in that context.
But you hear what he said as well? Us.
Yes.
There is a key element that is missing here, and you're neglecting the fact that people are able to understand within their communities who the us is and who the us isn't. Black people can walk through a community, see a bunch of black people and go like, oh, that person, I know they might be shifty or not, but it's not because they're black, it's not because their pants are sagging, it's not because you understand how someone may be moving in your hood, right? So it's different when Nipsey Hussle says us. What you're talking about is a police going them. They are criminals. They are all suspicious because they are not the us.
I don't think so. I don't think that's how I put it. The other point I'd make, too, is that in a lot of cities, the majority of police officers, like in New York, are not white. Right, so these are people who live in these communities, who come from these same communities, and I think they understand. I think they understand these points.
I understand.
I think they understand these distinctions.
Right, but I think there we get into a different issue, which is about how are police incentivized to make that, and that's separate. You're not arguing that, so let's not get into that. How are they incentivized to make their money?
Sure.
Let's talk a little bit more about the decarceration and the depolicing.
Yeah.
Here's something that a lot of people find confusing. When crime goes down, people argue that the police should get paid more. makes sense. When crime goes up, people say, well, the police should get paid more. It seems like policing is one of the few jobs or areas where, whether the outcomes are good or bad, more funding should go in. Joe Biden just announced that they're going to be pouring money into getting more and more and more police onto the streets. And my only question to you is, as a data person, what data is there to support that then, like, growing the police force more, putting more money into it is actually giving us the result that we're looking for?
The trove of studies showing that when you increase police presences, you reduce crime, and that you do so disproportionately in the neighborhoods with the biggest crime problems, right? So there have been studies, for example, random analyses that looked at policing presence along the National Mall in DC
Right.
shortly after 9/11, right? And what this study did was it looked at when the terror alert level changed, right? That was kind of a random thing that happened that you couldn't predict. The police presence would change. When the police presence increased, they found massive decreases in crime along the National Mall, which is where the presence increased. Every single study of policing that's been, there was a study out of UPenn that looked at expanding patrols of private police forces from the University of Pennsylvania Police Department outside the campus, and they found that when they did that, crime went down in those areas, right? So every time that this analysis is done, it shows the same thing. Now, we can argue about whether the costs associated with policing are worth the benefits, but one thing we know is that we haven't yet really figured out a way to produce the same kind of crime declines that policing has produced, particularly in the communities in which it's produced it. And I think that's a really, really important point, because when we argue about defunding the police, we're not arguing about ourselves, right? I live in a really good neighborhood. I'm sure you do too. We're arguing about people who have a very, very different day-to-day life. And one thing that it's important to understand is that crime is very concentrated. It's not something that's equally distributed across the country. In New York City, about 5% of street segments see about 50% of all crime. About 3.5% see about 50% of all violent crime. Every single year for which we have data, going back to at least 2008, a minimum of 95% of all shooting victims in the city are either Black or Hispanic, almost all of them male, right? That's one of the starkest, most persistent racial disparities in the data. We don't talk enough about it, and we don't talk enough about what it means to get crime down for those communities that are really dealing with it on a day-to-day basis.
I respectfully think we do talk about it. Those communities talk about it all the time. The people who are involved in these shootings talk about it all the time. Oftentimes, it just doesn't become a conversation in mainstream media.
But if you ask them what they want, they don't say less policing. 81% of Black Americans in the United States told Gallup last year that they want as much, if not more, policing that they're currently getting.
But I think if you're going to be fair to Black Americans, what they're also looking for is equal policing.
Absolutely.
They want the protecting and the serving part as well. Right?
Absolutely.
So here's where I find an issue with the data. I would not disagree with you. Having a police presence probably does mean that there is going to be a reduction in crime. However, it doesn't seem like a sustainable way to ensure that there is no crime, because all you're doing is saying, like, when a policeman is there, there is no crime. However, as soon as the policeman moves, the crime might come back. And then you're like, well, then we need more police, and then we need more. At the end of the day, the whole country is just police then, and then we all are the police, right? What I'm saying to you is this, is it seems to ignore the fact that crime comes from somewhere. And you talk about this in the book, sure, right? You talk about this in the book. You say that, according to the data you've seen, you don't believe that crime is caused by poverty. You don't believe that crime is caused by a lot of the things that people, you in fact believe that crime is caused by trauma, that crime is caused by what is happening in these communities. It's a vicious cycle.
Absolutely.
My question to you then is, if you believe those things, and in the same book you talk about, kids or just members of communities who are traumatized by these police, is it not then true that the police themselves are causing more of the crime because they're traumatizing the very communities they're supposed to be policing?
When they actually traumatize these communities, absolutely. The question is how often does that happen, particularly compared to the sort of trauma that's associated with serious crime and witnessing that crime and being abused as a child and being violently victimized, right? The argument is not that policing is perfect, right? If you're looking for someone to sit here and say that there's no way that we can reform the criminal justice system, that there's no room for improvement, it's not me. Right? The reality is that, these are human endeavors. Any human endeavor is going to be imperfect. People are going to make mistakes. People are going to be malevolent. They're going to be evil. They're going to exercise the powers that they're given, and they're going to abuse them. That happens. Right. I acknowledge that. But we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because when we do that, real people suffer real harm. And it's hard for, I think, a lot of people, to just internalize what that's like, right? I mean, every year for the last few years, the national homicide rate has kind of hovered around 5 or 6 per 100,000. There are neighborhoods on the west side of Chicago, West Garfield Park, for example, where the homicide rate is 131 per 100,000.
And so here's the thing that I find interesting in America. People will often argue about policing in those neighborhoods. People don't seem to talk enough about over-policing and under-policing. You know, your dad was a police officer,
He was,
right?
yeah.
And one thing I think everyone knows, you know, whether you are on the police force or whether you are a person who is in a community experiencing high crime, is that particularly in America, the over-policing and the under-policing give you a strange world where they present you a world where you don't know which is better for you. People often call the police don't show up, or they show up many hours after the incident has taken place. Or when the police do show up, they show up to terrorize the very communities that needed them for something else and now don't need them, but then now treat them as the criminals, right? And so what I find interesting in this conversation, people always bring up, oh, Chicago, and they bring up these places, the South Side, and they bring up, but they don't bring up the correlation of spending in these places. They don't bring up how much the government puts into these places, the parks that are in these places, the schools that are in these places, the aftercare programs that are in these places, the money that is put into these places. Do you get what I'm saying? Sure. People always make it seem like, oh, the Hamptons has no crime, probably because of the cops. It's like, well, how much do they put in? You know, where do the taxes get allocated? Where does the money go? And I think sometimes there's a strange, I'm not saying you're wrong, by the way, I'm just saying, do you consider that correlation as well?
Absolutely, and in the book I go through some of the data, you know, out of cities like Chicago, where you saw massive increases, for example, in per pupil spending on public education, where over, you know, just a handful of years, 2014 to 2016, you go from about 15% over the national average per pupil to about 30% over the national average per pupil. Between 2014 and 2016 in Chicago, murders went up, they didn't go down.
Yeah, but you see, look at that time period. What is the time period that you're measuring this over?
2 years.
Yeah, but I'll give you an analogy. When we look at building a soccer team anywhere in the world, I know Americans hate soccer, whatever. When we look at building a soccer team, do you know when you have to start? When they're children.
Sure.
And do you know when you look at the success? Is when they're old enough to play in the national team. And that's literally what we do. We go, okay, we want to win the World Cup in. You don't go, I want to win the next World Cup. It's impossible. You go, we're going to start a program where we will only see the results when this generation is old enough. What I feel like happens in America is every program that comes in, people go, oh, we got schools 2 years ago, and look, crimes went up. However, they don't use that same argument for police. We gave police money 2 years ago, however, crimes went still up. People are like, then we got to give more to the police, but they don't say, we got to give more to the schools. How come that doesn't happen?
Well, I'm all for giving as much money.
I'm just saying.
Like, I'm not against social spending.
No, you're not, and you're not. By the way, you're not. I don't even want to paint you as that. No, please, I'm not saying you are.
What I'm saying is that the relationship between these kinds of factors and violent crime is not consistent. It's not clear. What we do know is that we can reduce violent crime by taking violent criminals off the street. I mean, I frankly, for one, am tired of reading stories of really heinous crimes, homicides. I write in the book about a woman murdered in Chicago in 2019 by a guy who had 9 prior felony convictions, 1 for second-degree murder. What was he doing out on the street? I'm tired of reading stories about people raped, robbed by people who had 15, 20 prior arrests.
Rafael, be
that
fair.
happens a lot.
But be fair. You're a data guy, right? And now you're using anecdotal stories.
No, this is data. I can tell you that in Chicago, the average homicide suspect has 12 prior arrests. 20% have more than 20 prior arrests.
Okay, so now, again, I'm not saying any of this is wrong. What I'm arguing is the thesis you put forward in this book is that we need to get more police. We need to get more incarceration. This is the thesis of the book,
Not
right?
necessarily. I think the thesis of the book is more so that the calls to radically defund police and radically reduce incarceration
so you're not
are wrong.
So you're not for the fine. So would
this
you
is an
argue,
argument against the program, not an argument necessarily
so you don't
in
believe
favor
that
of
we should have
particular
more incarceration then?
I think actually in some places we do, yeah.
Okay, so you are saying yes to that.
We have an under-incarceration problem. We also have an over-incarceration.
Okay, so now let me ask you this question. Again, this is what I just go to is, oftentimes I find America is intent on solving the symptom but not the cause, okay? Let's talk about incarceration.
Sure.
Let's talk about incarceration.
Yeah.
I don't understand this, and I don't see any of the data about this in the book. America is a country where people say you serve the time, right? It implies that you pay the price for what you have done. However, once you have paid that price, you are not a functioning member of society. You do not come back into society. You are not allowed to get many jobs. In many places, you're not allowed to vote. You're not allowed to be a functioning member of society. And then people are surprised when those members now go into a certain society that we don't want them to be into. Yeah. Oh, it's the recidivism rate. The people are going back to prison. They're getting back into crime. But crime is an industry that accepts them regardless of what they've done, ironically, right? And so the thing I don't see in this book that I would love to know if there's any data on it is, What is the difference when people are actually given the opportunities? You know, you go to other countries around the world, they don't see prison as punishment. They look at it as rehabilitation. They go, we're going to take you off the streets. So I agree with you on this. Same thing we've been doing before police were even invented. In African villages, we'd go, you are going to be taken away from the situation you've created. However, the purpose is rehabilitation. We're either going to make you change, or if you won't, then we'll work from there. But American prisons don't change people for the better, and they don't give them an opportunity to come out being a better person.
Oftentimes,
and then they get surprised when the people do what they only now have options to do.
Yeah, oftentimes they make people worse, right? I mean,
We agree on this.
I am not a person who believes that the experience of incarceration is one that should be inhumane. It's one that, you know, people should suffer. I'm not a retributivist at
Right,
heart,
and you don't
right?
write that at all. Yes.
I think that to me, the main benefit of incarceration is incapacitation. It's taking people off the street so that the communities can have room to breathe as a result of
and I will say this to your credit, maybe
crimes.
something we actually can agree on is you do talk about how the court system is underfunded and overrun. And I will say one thing I did agree with you on is if we can get a better system that's more efficient, you won't have people who are stuck in the system who have done nothing wrong and shouldn't be there. Now, I argue a lot of that has to do with bad policing, but we won't go back into that. We won't go back into No. We agree on the court thing.
I'm glad we found something we can agree on. But
I think we agree on a lot. We're only talking about really like the finer details of what we don't. So,
but one quick thing on the rehabilitation point, you know, one of the assumptions underlying your argument is that we have figured out how to reliably rehabilitate people, particularly at scale, across a prison population of nearly 2 million people. We haven't. We don't have the infrastructure in place to do that, and we don't really know how to do that reliably. There's some programs that show some success. There's some that don't. Some investments that pay off, some that don't. Some programs that show success, you extend the observation period to 4 or 5, 10 years, and you see a reversion back toward the mean. I am all for, by the way, reducing the barriers to reentry. I think that's a huge problem. I've written this in the past. You know, the idea that you can't get an occupational license to be a barber or a cosmetologist because you have a criminal record is absolutely ridiculous to me. There's no reason why we should make it more difficult for people to reintegrate back into society. I'm not for that.
So to what you're saying, I'll even agree with you on that. I'll go, let's say we agree that the programs that we have aren't working, or you cannot guarantee that they work. You do not know if they work. You're uncertain. But we do know that the current system doesn't work.
Well, it doesn't work to do one thing, which is rehabilitate people.
That's not working.
It does work to incapacitate people. And
for how long and to what effect?
So that's the question, right? Is how long, right? So right now the median.
Because at some point you realize America just locks up everybody, and then what? No one's on the streets. There's no crime on the streets.
Less than 1% of people, of the population is in prison.
Yeah, but how much is that? Say that as a number. We go less than 1.
In prisons, it's about 700,000 people.
In prisons?
In prisons versus jails, right? So you got some people in jails. And some people, right.
Let's say behind bars.
So total incarcerated population is about 1.9 million people.
And then how many people are going through that prison system? How many people are getting arrested? And then how many? You know.
Sure, but not a lot of people get arrested go to prison. Right? There's this narrative in our country that we systematically deny people second chances, right? We have Second Chance Month in the United States. The typical person who gets released from prison had more than 10 prior arrests before they entered prison their most recent time, and more than 5 prior convictions. It's just not true that we deny people second chances. Only 40% of state felony convictions.
Well, we don't deny them typically, because you said the typical person.
Sure, right.
So we don't deny them typically.
There's certain you can.
But we don't know what the number on typical is.
You can dig into the data, and I'm sure find anomalous situations where people have been absolutely railroaded by the system. We should identify those people and release them. I say that in the book.
Yes.
Right. There is a subset of our incarcerated population that shouldn't be there. What I think people have failed to appreciate is there's a subset of our general population that should be incarcerated, that shouldn't be out on the street, and the costs associated with the failure to do that are real. They fall disproportionately on the most vulnerable communities in America. And it takes an incredibly gut-wrenching effect on people. I saw a video on Twitter the other day of a kid running on the west side of Chicago. He just happened to be walking home from school with his backpack, which was about half the size that he was. And he's walking past a group of kids who were targeted in a drive-by. He takes off running, and you can see the bullets still following him along the wall as he runs. They thought he was with them. His only mistake was walking past the wrong kids at the wrong time. And a huge part of the root of that problem in cities like Chicago and Baltimore and Philadelphia and Louisville is the systematic failure to take people who don't belong on the street off the street. I don't want to see any more of that.
I don't think anybody wants to see more of that, and I'll say 2 things before I let you go, because I'm loving this, by the way. Thank you for the conversation. The first part to that point is this. You know, the history of America is an interesting one in that people often talk about criminals as if there is no path to redemption and they are innately bad, when in fact, if you read through all of American history, oftentimes the people who become the families who are respected, oftentimes people who become the lawmakers, come from a history of crime. You know, you can go back all the way to the Boston Tea Party, to the smugglers who were creating what they were, you know, who were smuggling the tea, and they were, you know, breaking the law. You can move forward, you know, you go to whether it's the Kennedys, the Rockefellers, whatever you want it to be. One thing that I find interesting in America is, you know, it doesn't depend on whether or not you've done crime. It's whether or not you get the opportunity to turn that crime into a legitimate business. That's the first thing I find, right? I just want to talk about the video thing to what you're saying, because that reminded me of a part in your book where, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like you argue the videos we watch of police brutality make it seem like the situation is worse than it actually is, and you're saying it is not as bad as we think. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, people think that police use force on a very, very regular basis. I think they'd be very, very surprised to learn that studies have shown, for example, that police use force in less than 1% of arrests, that police fire their weapons in less than 0.03% of arrests. Again, in the aggregate, in a country of 330 million people, that's a lot. Right. Right, it's a big number. But as a percentage of total interactions, of total arrests, of situations in which force might be used but isn't, it's actually a very, very rare phenomenon, and thank God that it is. Again, doesn't mean we shouldn't try to reduce it further. But it is most certainly not a common outcome, a likely outcome of a police-citizen interaction. Now, I get the point that you're about to make, which is that, you know, well, aren't these videos like the one you just talked about the kid being, you know, shot at in Chicago, aren't those also creating the same kind of, misconception? And it's very, very important that you understand that those videos are also backed by data, right? More than a third of convicted violent felons in America were convicted, where they committed their crime when they were either out on parole, out on probation, or out on pretrial release. I mentioned earlier, in Chicago, average number of prior arrests for someone who is charged with either a shooting or a homicide is 12. 20% of those people have more than 20 prior arrests. So it's not as if these are just sort of cherry-picked anecdotes. This is what's reflected in the data.
I actually wasn't going to ask about that, but no, genuinely, I wasn't. But I wanted to hear what you were going to say.
I saw it going that way.
No, I wasn't. I was actually going to go to this. I really enjoyed the way you wrote this book because, you know, I don't agree with some of the conclusions you draw from the data, but I appreciate the way you've written it and that you've put thought into it and you acknowledge, you know, you don't make it seem like it's just people are just complaining about nothing. Sure. There's one thing that I would love, and I know we won't get to that answer now, but it's almost like a challenge to you as a data person is this. Time and time again in the United States, communities who are poor, you know, black communities, even very poor white communities, for instance, have complained about the treatment they receive at the hands of police. Yeah. And one thing that we've noticed time and time again is that the information we get oftentimes doesn't match the data. And I say this, you know, body cameras. I say that once you go into investigations into different police departments, we often find rampant racism, you know, we find corruption, we find signs that what the communities told people were actually true. And so my question to you as a data person is, with so much of the data that we look at in the world of crime coming from the police, do you not think that there should be an external source of data on crime, on everything that goes with incarceration that doesn't come from the people that we are actually trying to hold accountable to make sure that we're dealing with accurate data?
Sure. Absolutely. Again, you know, sort of implicit in that question is an accusation, right? That there's something wrong.
I'm saying because you're the data guy. That's
right. Well, so what we do have are victimization surveys, right? And what you would expect to see if there was, in fact, something wrong with the police data would be a serious incongruity between the police data and the data that's shown by victimization surveys. These are individuals who've been violently victimized who are, you know, reporting to survey takers what they've experienced.
Right.
We see the same thing with respect to use of force surveys. The public, people who have contacts are surveyed by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and they report how often they're subjected to uses of force, how often uses of force are threatened, how often police officers draw their weapons, and we don't see an incongruity between the police data and the data reported by people who have been surveyed who have had police contacts. So I think that should just give us a little bit of a sense of security that maybe something isn't completely off with this data.
I want to say thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for having a conversation with me. And last but not least, get the cornrows back. Let's go walk in the streets. Rafael's book, Criminal Injustice. A fascinating read is available now.